Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us once again. This is another video to educate the real estate industry. Our goal here at Homila Realty is to make sure that our clients have a clear understanding of all the forms that they're signing. And on top of that, we try to educate the industry as well. So for a lot of you that don't know how to fill up some of these forms, this video might be helpful. With the introduction of TRESA on December 1st, 2023, there has been a lot of changes in the way we handle our clients and the representation of the clients, as well as all the changes that were made to the forms. One of the forms that has caused a lot of confusion is the confirmation of cooperation. So today we're going to talk about how to fill up the confirmation of cooperation and how to understand when you come across this form and the section that's related to the relationship that you have with your real estate professional. So without any further ado, we're going to bring up the form on the screen just to make sure that everyone has everyone is able to have a peek and have a look at this form. And we're going to move along and explain every single page of this form. The form is Form 320. The name of this form is Confirmation of Cooperation and Representation. This is explanation of all the relationships that the salespeople involved in the transaction have with their clients or third party that is involved in that transaction. So the first page, the top of first page hasn't changed. We still have to put the name of the buyer on in the first section that you see here, and also the name of the seller, as you see, is used here in the second line, and then we have to put the address of the property. It's important that we basically put that information on the screen and make sure that this page is filled up properly. Then you move along and you go to the a little bit down in the page. You got the first explanation of the relationship, which is the listing brokerage. So if a listing brokerage is involved, we have 4 sections here. And remember, you're not supposed to select all these sections. Chances are the relationship that you have with the client is only fits one of these categories. So traditionally, what we did is we filled up 1A, which says the listing brokerage represents the interest of the seller in this transaction. And then underneath that, there were 2 options. One was the listing brokerage is not representing the buyer, which most of the times when you had a listing brokerage and cooperating brokerage, that was the case. But now the second one says the listing brokerage is providing assistance to a buyer and the buyer is self-represented party. With the introduction of SRT or self-represented party, this is a person that's not represented by anyone and they don't have a salesperson representing them. Therefore, this is the one that we select if the person is acting on their own or getting advice from a lawyer and they don't have a salesperson. So just like before, you're going to select 1A if you're the listing salesperson and not representing the other side. And number 1, obviously, if the buyer is not your client and you're not representing them. And number 2, if the buyer doesn't have any representation whatsoever. Okay. Now, then we get into a multiple representation scenario. So if you are actually representing someone else, then you have to select one of the other options that we have here. Now, the first one talks about multiple representation, but keep in mind that here it says that the listing brokerage has entered into a buyer representation agreement with the buyer and represents the interests of the seller and the buyer. This is when the listing brokerage and not just the salesperson, but the listing brokerage in whole, because now we have 2 types of representation. We have a listing brokerage representation, and also we have the designated representation, which is just the salesperson representing the client. If the brokerage has an agreement with both buyer and seller, then 1B has to be selected. Okay? Now let's assume that the clients don't have a relationship directly with the brokerage, and they are basically either have a limited service representation with the brokerage, or they have a designated representation. Okay. In a situation like that, we go to number C when they have a limited service representation, meaning that we are representing the seller. So the listing brokerage is representing both the seller and buyer, but one of the two parties, either a buyer or seller, doesn't have a full representation, but they have a limited service representation. That's another form that we're going to provide you with explanation and a video for it. But a limited service representation is basically pick and choosing some of the services that salespeople provide. But in this case, again, it's a multiple representation because although it's a limited service representation, but keep in mind that because we're representing both parties, then we're still multiple representation. But if one of them has a limited service representation, we're going to select part C. Now here comes the new representation that we talked about, which is designated representation. If the salesperson individually is representing the client, although they're representing the client, the broker is still providing service to that client. So we have to select part D, but we have to select one of the options that we have in part D. And if you look at the options that we have, the number one says the listing brokerage designated representatives represent more than one client in the same trade, meaning that the same salesperson is representing two people, and those people are in designated representation situation. Okay. And in a situation like that, you have a multiple representation because both buyer and seller are represented by the same individual. And in a situation like that, number one would be the correct option that you select. Now, number two says the seller client and buyer client are each separately represented by different designated representatives. Now, meaning that two salespeople from the same brokerage are representing two different individuals, and both of those people are involved in this transaction. In a situation like that, because both of them have designated representation, it's not a multiple representation. So we will select number two. That's basically two salespeople from the same brokerage representing two clients. And those two clients, either they're a buyer and seller on the same transaction, or both of them are putting an offer on the same property. So regardless of the situation, if two people are involved in the same transaction, and then it's even though both of them are from both of these individuals, the salespeople are from the same brokerage, it's not going to be a multiple representation because all of those relationships are designated representation. Now, number three says the designated representative is providing representation to the seller client and the broker is providing the service. So number three can be selected as well when you have a designated representation. So meaning that, basically explains that when you have a designated representation, the salesperson is providing service or representation. The salesperson provides service and representation to the client, and the brokerage is only providing service. And that's the case with every single designated representation. I hope this clarifies listing brokerage section. If you have any questions, you can put it in the comments below, and we're going to try to address all the questions that come in regards to this section or any other section that we're going to be discussing here. But the goal is to make sure that everyone is clear of how this is supposed to be filled up. Just keep in mind that you cannot select more than one section. You either select A, B, C, or D, depending on the type of relationship that you have with the clients. Now, bottom of the page is still the same. You basically have four circles for the initials, and you're going to fill it up the same way before. Both buyer, seller, cooperating brokerage, or buyer brokerage, and the listing brokerage has to initial this section. Now we go to page 2, talking about a property sold by a buyer brokerage, meaning that the buyer has a relationship with the buyer, and they have a representation of the buyer. The buyer salesperson is representing the buyer, but there is no listing brokerage. So it could be a FSBO, for sale by owner. It could be just a door knocking that you have a buyer for. you're door knocking a home and the seller wants to sell the house, but they don't want to list, and your buyer wants to purchase that property. In a situation like that, we use the second section, which is property sold by a buyer brokerage. Now, obviously, the first option, number A, says the brokerage represents the buyer, and that's the case because we are representing the buyer. But the number 1 and 2 basically says who's going to pay for the commission. Number 1 says if the buyer is going to pay directly, so the seller is not paying the commission. Number 2 says this by the seller in accordance with the seller limited service representation agreement, meaning that you talk to the seller and say, hey, listen, I have a buyer. If you pay me commission, I'm going to bring you an offer because I have a relationship with the buyer, and the buyer is supposed to pay a commission when I find them a home. But if you are willing to pay that commission, because the buyer has asked me to, basically see if you're willing to pay that. And basically, if that's the case, then we're going to select number 2, but we have to sign an agreement, which is called a limited service representation, meaning that we're not signing a full representation of the seller, but we have a limited service representation with the seller, and the seller says, I'm going to pay you. That's not a problem. Okay. Now, obviously, just like before, we have multiple representation here. So if you're actually representing the seller and the buyer in the same transaction, then we have to select the multiple representation, okay? Meaning that the buyer and seller both have a representation agreement with us. And this is the case when this is happening at the brokerage level, not a designated representation, but a brokerage representation. And this is where we select multiple representation. Number C talks about, once again, about the limited service representation. So when you have a buyer that's represented by the brokerage, and then you have a seller that has limited service representation with the brokerage. Now, if we have selected number A and number 2 here, meaning that we have a limited service representation with the seller, then we also have to select number C, saying that multiple representation is happening and there's a limited service representation. Now, this could be, the limited service representation could be with the buyer or the seller. Doesn't matter. But this number C is when one of them or both of them have limited service representation. And part D, once again, talks about designated representation, when the representation is only with the salesperson, not the brokerage. In this case, just like before, number 1 is when the salesperson is providing designated representation for both parties, okay, and buyer and seller, and it is actually a multiple representation situation. Number 2 talks about the fact that buyer and seller client are separately represented by different people at the same brokerage, which is not a multiple representation because there are 2 salespeople representing 2 individuals, and both of those are designated representation. Therefore, you don't have a multiple representation. And number 3 talks about the designated representatives providing the representation and the brokers providing the service, which is the case when you have a designated representation. So you would select number 3 as well when you have a designated representation, just to reiterate that, the who's providing what type of service to the client. Okay. Once again, if you have more questions, put a comment below, and we're gonna try to address all the questions that you have. Now we're going to go to part 3, which is cooperating brokerage. So traditionally, what we did is when we were at the cooperating brokerage, we filled this section up by selecting number A and number 1, and I'm going to explain what that means. Nothing has changed here. When you are the cooperating brokerage, you select A, meaning that you're representing the buyer. There's a listing salesperson that's representing the seller. And then you would select number A1, which says the cooperating brokerage represents the interest of the buyer. Now, if you have basically someone that has a seller limited service agreement with you, then in that case, you would select number 2. Okay. So remember the case that we talked about where the basically the seller signed a limited service agreement with us to provide us with commission. In that case, basically, we would select that one, but keep in mind, this is only when the buyer, we're not representing the buyer, we're only representing the the seller with a limited service representation, but the buyer is a self-represented party. Because for the other case, we already have selections in the previous sections that we could select. So if we're not representing the buyer, but we have a limited service agreement with the seller telling us they're going to pay us commission, then in that case, we can basically select, as a cooperating brokerage, select A2. And then the next section, part B, talks about commission. So the first one, you select if the commission is what's paid on MLS. And the second one is when you have a special arrangement in regards to commission, then you can basically write it down. And the bottom of the page, again, there are the initials that you have to put by all parties involved. Now, the third page that you have here is just the signatures. And as you see, you have acknowledgement that all parties acknowledge. Over here for the two different listing companies, they basically put their information here and they put their signature saying that they are basically representing the clients in this transaction. And the page after that would be the box about the consent to multiple representation. So if there is a multiple representation, you also have to get the two parties to initial these two circles. Now remember, for multiple representation to happen, both parties have to agree. And they both have to sign a document indicating that they agree to the multiple representation. If that happens, then you're allowed to do multiple representation. But if one of the parties refuses, then you're not allowed to get involved in the transaction. You have to ask one of the parties to find someone else to represent them. But if they consent and they initial this, then they sign the bottom of this page, and the form is filled up properly and correctly. Now, with that said, I think Aurea has not done a really good job with this form, and I think we're going to see revisions of this form very soon because, as you saw, there are sections here that can be modified to be more clear and more concise in terms of who represents who. I think this form was done in a rush, and in my opinion, they're probably not happy with it neither. And pretty soon they're going to have a new version of it released. And if that happens, we're going to do another video just explaining the form. So I've already reached out to Aurea, trying to get in touch with them, indicating what parts of the form needs improvement and change. We'll see if they ever call back or respond to our inquiry. They are pretty busy because, as you know, everybody's trying to get clarification regarding these forms. We're in December 2023, which is when these forms were released, and it's been only a few days that they released these forms. And probably by now they're looking back at these forms and they're thinking, okay, maybe we could have done a better job with this. Anyways, once again, thanks for joining us in our YouTube channel. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell button so you're notified of all the future videos that we do, and you can like the video. If you have any questions or comments, just put them below this video, and we're going to try to address as many of them as possible. Thank you for watching this video, and see you soon.